talking to Professor Matthew McManus, not to be confused with the American television writer of the same name, which is funny. Anyway, you are the author of Liberal Socialism. You're the author of a bunch of books. You study the socialism, but you also study the right, and both will be topics of our discussion today. We're going to begin by picking up where we left off in the Liberal Socialism book. We talked a lot about Mill and R.H. Tawney, to a lesser degree Bernstein, and McPherson, and a little bit of Rawls, my Brett Knorr. But we didn't talk as much about some of the other aspects of the book. So I wanted to talk to you about Carlo Roselini today, and maybe get into where you think this is now after MOOF and Llau. And then we'll talk about the right, because in some ways, I feel like MOOF and Lau's focus on populism. We can also throw Negri and Hart into this as well.
Do like a 2000s throwback party if you're in critical theory.
Right. I mean, yeah. Like when you or I were just probably either getting out of high school or undergraduates, these were the hottest book. It is weird that MOOF and Lau and Hart and Negri were on the New York Times bestseller list, because those books are written in some of the most opaque language I've ever read.
It was weird for me. I remember when I read Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, people were like, the most popular book in left critical theory in 20 years, you know, these kind of euphemisms. And I read it, I'm like, damn, this is actually probably one of the most frustrating things to actually just have to go through, not in terms of its content, although we can get to that, right? Just in terms of the style. I don't know. Weird.
Yeah, it was a strange time. It was one of those books that I was like, are people actually reading this, or do you just own it to say you own it? Like, it was one of those.
What do they say? It was like A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking, Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, and then, I guess Hart and Negri's Empire. You know, the three books that will just sit there. Everybody will, use them to impress, their visitors and stuff, and they'll never actually crack them open.
Yeah, Piketty's. I did read most of that Piketty book. I skimmed through certain parts of it, but I find it funny because I was like, oh, this book invokes Marx and has clearly never actually engaged with Marx much. I think Piketty's probably engaged with Marx more since he wrote that book.
Definitely.
And when he wrote that book.
Well, to be fair to him, right, in 2014, I mean, he was definitely more egalitarian than the average economist. That's kind of the whole point of the book. But now he just overtly identifies as a socialist. He's very happy to kind of argue for some pretty egalitarian reforms. So I always tell people, don't judge a book by its cover, and definitely don't prejudge somebody in terms of how radical they're willing to go. You got some critiques from people like David Harvey, seems to have internalized them. And, there are plenty of Marxist critiques you can make of his work still. But in terms of his socialist bona fides, I don't think that there's any begrudging him that.
No, he does seem like a good center-left socialist. I mean, who knows where anybody lives up? I mean, like, hell, Francis Fukuyama has become like a social democratic adjacent at this point, so who the fuck knows?
I think that Francis Fukuyama is basically just like, look, anybody who's not fucking crazy and on the right, I'll kind of flirt with your team for a little while, and if you want me to say some nice things about you, then sure, I publish about a book a year. We'll throw some shade at you. We'll show some compliments your way, right?
Mm-hmm. I wanted to talk to you about Carlo Roselini, because we didn't talk much about Roselini, but Rossellini's interesting because of the way in which he tries to triangulate a socialism that is in confrontation with both Marxism and fascism, but isn't exactly the same as like Nordic social democracy nor anarchism. Yep. So what do you see as Carlo Rossellini's relevance to liberal socialism?
Sure. Well, part of it is he just wrote a book called Liberal Socialism.
Well, that does it.
That was very helpful, right? But look, in terms of his contribution, it's important to give a little bit of background. Right? Carlo Roselli was born quite wealthy, actually, but associated over the course of his life with the Italian left and various different socialist movements, depending on what was in vogue at the time. He was always very pro-democracy, which meant that from the beginning he was at least somewhat wary of the Bolshevist strains of the Italian left. Although all that ceased to be particularly relevant when the fascists came to power, the Italian Fascist Party, right, and pretty much just jailed leftists across the country, including Rosselli, right? So it was actually in prison that Rosselli wrote a lot of liberal socialism, and it really reads like that. It's kind of like Gramsci's prison notebooks, right? There's not an awful lot of references. There's a lot of taciturn characterizations of figures that you can't quite get away with talking about directly. It's very much a polemic, right? It's not exactly a scholarly, well, let's look at this from the standpoint of, X, Y, and Z perspective. It's kind of fierce in its implications. And really, it's the only thing that he wrote of substance, right? And that's not because he wasn't a talented guy. I actually think he had a lot more to give, but he died fighting against Spanish fascism after he had been released from prison, right? So very much a guy who was willing to put words into action, and quite tragic. I think he had a lot more to give had he lived.
What are the key ideas did you find in his liberal socialism book that you found helpful to your own, other than the title?
Well, there are a few different things, right? The two kind of core, well, the three core parts of the book is one is quite a probing critique of fascism and why he thinks that the Italian socialist and the Italian left parties generally weren't able to confront it adequately. And this leads to the second part. A lot of the reason he blames Italian leftists for not being able to confront fascism is he says they never really took the time to understand its appeal. For a lot of the more mechanistically minded socialists who made up the dominant members of the socialist intellectual class, it was pretty much inevitable that capitalism was going to fall. You just needed to wait. And so Italian fascism was at best a kind of last hurrah for the bourgeoisie united with different reactionary elements. All one needed to do was kind of hold out for the working class to eventually rise up against it, and then everything would be hunky-dory. And Rosselli, I think quite rightly, and I know you have some sympathy for this, says no, right? Fascism had a real appeal, including to many of the proletariat, because they recognize that a lot of these mechanistic, deterministic, or even scientific ideas that are being floated by the left just don't really appeal to people's affective convictions. They really went for the gut with these appeals to nationalism, spiritualism, the resurrection of the people. And Rosselli is in no means saying that socialists should do the same, right? He's very critical of fascism as a species of irrationalist reactionary thinking. But he says if you fail to understand its appeal and you just kind of chalk it up to the latest turn of a historical dialectic, you're not really being the best political agent, and you're not actually thinking all that carefully about how to confront this every day, the way a political movement should once engaged in real and concrete politics. So that's something that I think is very important about his book, certainly for the time, right? Now, the second part of his book, which you can be more critical of, and I was more critical of in my own reading, is he tends to assume that this mechanistic, deterministic approach to Marxism he saw as being common on the Italian left at that point, was just the way that Marx himself actually thought. On his reading, and this is true of Bernstein as well, Marx just thought that the inexorable contradictions of capitalism were going to bring about the emergence of a society where the free development of each would be the condition for the free development of all. So there wasn't necessarily, on this reading at least, very much politically to do, except to wait for this process to unfurl and take advantage of the right moment when it finally appeared. And Rosselli is very critical of this, saying, no, the reality is that individual human actors still make a difference in history. He's not a proponent of Carlylean great man theory, right? But he does say, even the smallest person can change the course of history, as Galadriel once put it, albeit in ways they don't necessarily understand. And again, he's critical of this version of Marxism, which he just takes to be Marxism, for rendering the left politically impotent in Italy when confronted with various fascist movements. And I mean, in the book, I'm very critical of this reading of Marx, right? I say there's without a doubt plenty of Marxists out there that do have this very mechanistic and deterministic reading of him. I say that today, right? There's plenty of people you can go online, and that's just the way that they interpret Marx. But I think if you actually look at the core texts of Marxism, some of which just weren't available to him, to be fair, right? It's very obvious that Marx has a much less deterministic and much more contingency-minded approach to understanding history than this kind of reductive and orthodox view would suggest. And then the last part of his book, obviously, is an argument for liberal socialism, which kind of brings everything together. So his argument is to say, look, once we recognize that individual human beings and movements can make history and make choices about where they want to go, we can recognize that there's actually a deep symmetry with liberalism on the part of socialism, since liberals have always understood the importance of the free individual trying to recreate his or her life world in a way that'll be more emancipatory and free. Now, the socialist element of this comes in, as Rosselli says, the reality is that by and large, liberals have been indifferent to achieving freedom, whether historical or personal freedom, for the working poor. And what socialism is going to do for the first time in history is make the promise of liberalism true for everyone, but in particular for the poor. And he discusses a variety of different normative arguments for this, the importance of equality and emancipation. But the book more or less ends with this kind of promise to deliver a robust account of liberal socialism that will be popular, dynamic, and able to confront reactionary forces across Europe. And again, sadly, he died before he was able to ever produce something that actually lived up to that promise. Well, he had better things to do, right? Fighting fascists is a noble cause in any generation.
I mean, well, Rosselli is an interesting contrast to both Gramsci and Amigo Bordiga. I mean, who basically who is not actually, necessarily super messianistic, but in the terms of fascism, never thought that fascism should receive special opposition from socialists because he just thought it was a form of capitalist government and you should oppose it like you should any other capitalist government. And that includes not making alliances with liberals. And Rosselli is basically, coming at it from almost the exact opposite standpoint. And they're all in prison at around the same time. So it's a very interesting set of contrasts there.
Yeah, I want to just add. I mean, you can compare his work to Gramsci in some interesting ways. Now, I'm not here in any way implying that Rosselli is a thinker on a par with Gramsci, right? That'd be a very foolish thing to say. But Gramsci himself was interested in why it is that, again, these more mechanistic and deterministic accounts of Marxism that were very centered around the economy and the motor of history didn't turn out to pan out, right? And why so many of the working classes ended up being quite happy to vote for Mussolini, or at least willing to subordinate themselves to him. And a lot of the stuff that he wrote about in prison, of course, related back to how hegemony operates, why it is that people don't necessarily work in the pursuit of work to pursue their own interests, certainly their class interests. And Rosselli was pissed off about the same kind of things, right? He just tackled it from a somewhat different direction.
And it's interesting also to contrast him with a lot of the rest of the liberal tradition in Italy, because the liberal tradition in Italy, if we're kind of direct, is a lot uglier than the liberal tradition in English-speaking countries. I mean, because you look at Pareto, Robert Mosher, who wasn't a liberal, he was a former anarchist, but the elite school, which mostly did come out of Italian liberalism, with some exceptions, Robert Mosher being one of the exceptions.
Also worth noting that when Mussolini was first in power, prior to the 1930s and the Depression, his government was actually famous for adopting a somewhat liberal, in the broad sense, economic approach, right? Taught a lot of benefits to people, obviously crushed unions, had the support of many different liberals and industrialists throughout the country. All this is well known, right? In fact, there are some economists who characterize him as imposing a kind of austerity on Italy avant la lettre, right? Now, things shifted in the 1930s, obviously, with the Depression, because Mussolini was not a man of deep economic convictions, or any convictions, really, aside from Mussolini now, Mussolini forever, right? But, to your point, there were a lot of reasons why Rosselli was kind of going out on a limb to call himself a liberal socialist at that point, because there are definitely a lot of good reasons why socialists would be then as now wary of any kind of association with liberalism.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about when I think about the names I associate with Italian liberalism in specific, it's like Pareto, and it's just and these are not, these are people who were frankly somewhat fascist sympathetic if they had lived long enough, and their devotees were fascist sympathetic.
Or to this day, I mean, Pareto is Jordan Peterson's favorite economist, right?
Right, exactly. So it's interesting. This does kind of get to, my reading. We've gone back and forth for me as I'm more skeptical of liberal socialism than you, but I do think that we have to admit that all this, both the socialistic and a lot of the weird authoritarian, actually do have legitimate roots in Enlightenment liberalism in the quote classical sense, and that we shouldn't be ceding classical liberalism to the libertarians as an idea. Like, it's not like we also are, even if you don't consider yourself a liberal, and I don't. I admit that my tradition emerged out of that, and it has to be kind of acknowledged that Marxism didn't come from nowhere. Like,
yeah, and I think that you and I are kind of uniquely okay with that, in part because we spent a lot of time reading right-wing thinkers, right? And one of the things that really comes to the foreground when you read right-wing thinkers is the kind of narcissism of small differences that can emerge, certainly on the left, right? But even between the left and liberalism, because there are many people on the right, including some quite interesting thinkers, credit where due, who are like, the Enlightenment was a mistake, just the whole thing, right? Not any of it is worth redeeming, and we should really go back to, you take your pick. Aristotle,
Aristotle, Paul Godfrey's The Austro-Hungarian Empire. A lot of people.
Curtis Yarvin is like, we need to go back to the pre-English Civil War, you name it, right?
Yeah, but we need Jacobites, or some of them are even like, let's bring back the Capetians, the Carolingians, or the Moravians. Like, it's just but not too far back, because we don't want any of that semi-equality that you see in the early Roman Republic. So it's got to be somewhere between like 100 AD and 1500 AD.
Yeah, we don't want to go so far back that we get to like polyamorous communism, right? That's where we got to cut it off. So
yeah,
and to your point, I mean, I don't have any problem with people saying they just can't bring themselves to call themselves a liberal socialist or identify with liberalism in any way, shape, or form. I mean, my buddy Ben Burgess, who I know you've had some fights with, right, has said that to me often, right? He's like, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. It's just, if you had lived in America, is what he always tells me, you'd know. It's just too hard a pill to swallow, calling yourself a liberal of any sort. And I'm like, I get it, right? I'm glad, though, at least that you're acknowledging, though, a kind of shared genealogy between the two traditions. That's just kind of what I'm hoping for.
Yeah. Friend of the show and personal interlocutor and arguer of mine. I mean, Ben and I are pretty close, but we don't agree on that. We agree on a lot when faced with the right, and even some liberals. We don't agree on much when you're actually dealing with the left. But I do find it interesting that, like, he's like, I can't go there, and I'm like, well, from my perspective, an analytic Marxist is basically a liberal anyway. So
well, I mean, you should tell him that. I've been trying to push him that way too. It's like, look, you're almost all the way there, right? It's just, what did Heath Ledger say? Just a little push, right? And then you'll be.
So this brings us, though, to the interesting, liberal-ish developments of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s that emerged in sort of post-Apparismo scenario, post-autonomia in Italy, and then whatever the fuck was going on in France. Whenever I go back to the left in France in the 70s and 80s, it's like a weird non-Euclidean geometric tree where, like, you're just like, so these
we need topological geometry to make sense of that shit, right?
Yeah, these guys were Maoists, then they became left communists, and then later on they were Breton ultra nationalists, and then this group was socialist, and then they got into postmodernism, and then these guys were socialist and they were left communist, and all of a sudden they were like making common cause with Nazis to deny that the Holocaust happened so that we could not justify the Popular Front.
Yeah, but that's kind of what I enjoy about French philosophy and French leftism, though. It's like, man, like, people are complaining right now. It's like, oh, American politics has gotten weird. There's all these kind of weird, fucked up ideologies that appear. It's like, yeah, just go back to France throughout the 20th century. All of them are there, right? It's the people who are like, I am a very, very, very conservative, bordering on fascistic Marxist, or I'm a Gramscian ultra-nationalist. And you're like, well, whatever, fuck it, just fine.
Yeah. Well, it does... Controversial thesis that no one on either side of this ocean will like. I think the French and the Americans, we are way more alike than anyone wants to admit, and that is why we don't like each other.
Oh, but did you hear what the Trump administration said just this week, right? You know, if it wasn't for the Americans, all the French would be speaking German right now, right?
Well, if it wasn't for the French, we'd all still be fucking British. This would already be Canada.
And that comment also pissed me the fuck off. It's like, you know, it's just nobody in this country ever going to fucking acknowledge the Soviet Union's role in World War II. We're just going to be like, oh, that whole part of the world, that whole war, that's just going to be like that screen in old video games. It's like, oh, it's just nothing happening there. It's off screen, out of mind.
Yeah. You know, it's funny because it's just like, you know, the Russians lost more than anyone else, and arguably, if Germany had fought a run front war with either the United States and Britain in what the resistance in France or the Soviet Union, without it being two fronts, Germany probably would have won that war.
Oh, I have no doubt. I mean, Richard Evans, who's probably the best English historian on Nazi Germany, points out that like there was never anything less than 70% of Axis forces concentrated on the Eastern Front after 1941. Usually, it was a bit more like 80, right? And you know, you can even just compare the scale of the victories, right? I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not undermining the Allied or Western Allied contribution, right? The victories in Tunis were very, very important. Battle of the Bulge, very important. The material resources given to the Soviet Union, which the Soviets themselves didn't like to acknowledge, very important, right? But, you know, in Tunis, you know, one of the biggest victories the Western Allies won. They took about 300,000 Axis prisoners. Big victory, right? Compare that to Stalingrad, where about 1.2 million Axis soldiers died, and you know, a couple 100,000 were captured. Just totally different scale.
Yeah. Although, I mean, the one thing I do like to remind people when we get really into this, it would have helped if Stalin had not tried to play 35-dimensional chess and then armed Hitler. Much in the late 30s.
When people sit there and they offer apologies for Stalin, being like, oh, you know, he was the one who completely defeated Hitler because he was the genius who knew what he's doing. I'm like, really? I mean, in 1941, when the tanks were advancing on Moscow and he was not doing anything for days, I'm sure at least it must have crossed his mind once or twice. He's like, man, did I ever fuck up bad, didn't I?
He disappeared to his dacha for a week. But anyway,
I'll really get us out of here.
I don't want to get into this because I kind of find the pro and anti-Stalin both sides of those debates really obnoxious. But I when I think about the war, I'm like, he was a good wartime leader by 42, you know, by 42 and 43, because he learned to delegate.
But I could just learn, like, look, I can't run this whole fucking thing myself. So maybe it's better if I trust a few people provisionally, right?
Right. But I don't want to downplay that, but like he thought that Hitler was more rational than Hitler was. I mean, he really, like, reading his diaries, he really does seem surprised, like, he did what? And they're still at what? Like, I mean, so much so that when his spies in Japan were telling him that the Germans were amassing at the border, he didn't believe them.
I know. And they even told him, like, the invasion is imminent. Like, prepare right now. Like, it's coming in any day. And he was like, it's got to be a deep fake, right? It's like, really? Do you really think all that stuff that Hitler said about, you know, the subhuman Slav and creating a gigantic empire in the East was just something he's going to forget about? Like, he went on and on about it continuously, right?
Way
Fucking,
more
like,
than he talked about taking over the West. Like,
yeah, exactly. Like, fucking,
anyway.
if you were Hitler's friend, he's the kind of guy. It's like, oh, how are your kids? By the way, have you heard my plan about turning Ukraine to an ash-laden German colony? Let's get into that.
Anyway, I know I'm going to get comments on that in the show notes. So I do find it interesting though, because basically the middle of the 20th century, you have the Nordic social democracies, you have Western European post-Soviet Marxism, which develops into Eurocommunism, which I wouldn't entirely say was liberal, but wasn't totally not either. And by the 80s and 90s, you get, I mean, yeah, a bunch of very strange ideologies, particularly in France and Italy. But you also get this kind of liberal populist socialism that's kind of, I mean, at the time, even as a young non-socialist, I wasn't a socialist when I was reading stuff. I was actually a conservative, but I think I called it half-ass Marxism in my 20s. So like, I always think of Thurburn's book From Marxism and Post-Marxism, and like, this is what we get at the end of that. MOOF and Llau, it's hard for people post 2010, I think, to get how important they were, because
that book was everywhere, right? Absolutely everywhere. You couldn't pick up a text in critical theory for about 20 years without like the requisite citation of Hegemony and Socialist Strategy.
It's Hegemony and Socialist Strategy and Antagonistics. Those are the two books by them you had to read. So in which ways are they liberal and which ways are they not? I mean, in your book, you argue that they actually kind of represent a big tension in socialist thought. So I wanted to go on that. And then we'll go into Axel Hanith and Habermas, my least favorite philosopher. So, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, Hanith and Habermas are just the most exciting people to talk about, you know? Well, look, I would actually push back on the characterization of Llau and MOOF as a duo, as liberal socialists, because I'm very sure Ernesto Llau would reject that characterization. MOOF, though, by the 1990s, embraced calling herself a liberal socialist explicitly, and has more or less wore that label, I want to say proudly, but consistently, all the way up into 2018, when she writes For Left Populism. But Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, just to kind of provide a bit of context, was a seminal book. I do not particularly like it, and I want to be clear that I'm moderately critical of MOOF in the text. But essentially what Llau and MOOF argued there is something that everyone's familiar with right now, but seemed radical back in the day, which is that Marxism had an essentialist understanding of how politics worked. It was really, really focused on this idea of emancipation on the basis of class. MOOF and Llau argue, well, actually, just leaning really, really heavily on class or the working class as the vehicle for emancipation is not good enough, and it's certainly not going to allow you to overcome the various forms of hegemonic domination that operate in society, and that operates in multifaceted ways, depending on, you know, whether we're talking about patriarchy or white supremacy or heteronormativity. You get the idea, right? So essentially the book concludes with an argument for what they sometimes call the post-Marxist approach to socialist politics, stitching together these different groups who are marginalized in some way, shape, or form in society, giving them an enemy that would unite them all together. That was a very important part of their work, this kind of agonistic dimension to it. And then trying to use the coalition that you form to agitate for what was sometimes called an agonistic democracy, right? A much more democratic way of life, where rather than trying to subsume the differences in society, where we would allow them to exist and to, if not struggle, at least push up against one another without that ever becoming antagonistic, even if it sometimes could be agonistic, right? And truthfully, like a lot of left theory at the time that was very Pomo inspired, it's not exactly clear what the practical implications of this are supposed to be, right? Sometimes they would point to real world examples, which some socialists were quite sympathetic to, including myself, right? By saying, look, rather than adopting this kind of conciliatory, dialogical attitude towards conservatives, for example, the left needs to be much more willing to name enemies and mobilize people on that basis. And that's where they can be critical of a certain kind of liberal centrism, at least the attitude of liberal centrism. Think about somebody like Chuck Schumer just this week, right? That's exactly who they were kind of targeting. This person who would say, well, there are some good Republicans out there. Maybe if I model, dialogical and cross-partisan behavior, they're going to come on board. MOOF and Llau would say that's completely, naive, right? It's not going to happen, especially when you're confronting reactionary forces. But then, by the 1990s, MOOF at least did start to specify the ingredients in her politics a little bit more. And it's a very weird stew, as you probably know, right? Because she's very interested in postmodern thinkers like Jacques Derrida. She's also deeply intrigued by the writings of Carl Schmitt, who I'm sure all your listeners know as the fascist philosopher par excellence, or fascist jurist par excellence from Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. And then she identifies as a liberal or a liberal socialist, albeit one who does not write all that much about class-based antagonisms. So how does this all fit together? Well, kind of in the way I described, but with some specifically Moofian kind of amendments. She says, look, liberalism is committed at its best to this idea that we are not going to try to eradicate deep pluralism. And that is very much an idea that socialists need to get on board with. And she's critical of certain Marxist or for left theorists that imagine that in a post-liberal society, there's going to be so much solidarity that differences are going to be effaced, right? So we need a kind of liberal outlook into the foreseeable future. The Schmitt angle comes in where she says part of the problem with this is liberals have always underestimated the extent to which the differences in society are going to produce antagonisms, engender the sense that there are enemies that we need to overcome. So we need to have a kind of Schmittian awareness of this and be willing as liberal socialists to name names and call out the people who are trying to eliminate difference precisely. And then the postmodern dimension of this was a kind of wariness, again, of any kind of totalizing discourse or totalizing approach to political identity that suggests, in a socialist future, differences of race, differences of gender, differences of sexual orientation will be overcome or no longer be in any way, shape, or form politically significant, and will become one community without the need for any kind of politics, right? Circa Derrida, Foucault, and many others, she's like, there's never going to be a moment where we arrive at the end of history or a big T truth moment where we have access to just the way everything should be. And so we're just going to have to accept there's going to be politics for the foreseeable future. That's a simplification, I want to be clear, but I think it's about as down to earth as I can make their work without getting into a lot of jargon.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm actually sympathetic to the last point. I do sort of get
Sure.
tired when people are like, "Oh, racism will just go away with socialism." And I'm like, racism as we know it will go away. But that I've studied the Soviet Union and China too much to think that it just magically goes away because you deal with class antagonism. There was all kinds of ethnic pogroms that broke out during the Yuzovchina and during the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. Two events that I have, the Yuzovchina, I have a solely negative view on. That's the Purges, for those of you who don't call it by its Russian name. And the Great Proletarian Social Revolution, I actually somewhat speculatively, but I actually think it prevented a civil war. And so if you know anything about civil wars in China, they tend to be some of the bloodiest affairs in human history. See the Boxer Rebellion, which killed, I think it killed, like 20 times the U.S. Civil War. And we don't even call it a war. It's just like...
It's also astonishing, right? Because almost nobody in the West knows about that, right? It's like, and this conflict was taking place on a scale that was vastly larger than almost anything else that was going on in the world at the time.
Yeah, it's... Americans, particularly American socialists, learn your Chinese history and start before 1929. But anyway.
So what your Uncle Varn is giving you for homework?
I'm a teacher. That's what I do.
That's true.
You also address at the end of your book the kind of interesting and somewhat parallel development in the post Adorno Horkheimer Frankfurt School. You focus on Axel Honneth. I mean, the three biggies of the what we might call the last generation of the Frankfurt School would be Raymond Geist or Geuss, Raymond Geuss, Axel Honneth, and Habermas. And people know my opinion of Habermas. I think I call him a traitor like 3 times a year. Yeah. But I just ritually excoriate him. But Axel Honneth and Habermas are interesting because it's a shift back towards Euroliberalism in socialist thought in like a Marxian Hegelian sense that parallels MOOF and Llau and MOOF and Bobbio.
Oh, Norberto Bobbio.
Yeah. But is not the same as. So you want to go into that a little bit?
Sure. Well, one of the reasons I included Honneth in the same chapter as MOOF is I actually think they pair together quite well, oddly enough, because where MOOF is very insistent on this kind of postmodern, deconstructionist, agonistic approach to politics, which has its virtues. I mean, like you, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that there is a problem with a liberalism that's afraid to name names and recognize that politics can be a struggle, right? However, MOOF, in terms of what the practical implications of liberal socialism should be, it's very vague, right? It's very, very unclear to me what an agonistic democracy, let alone a liberal agonistic democracy, is going to look like in practice, let alone what the socialist component of this is going to be if we take seriously the call for economic democracy, right? Honneth, on the other hand, in Habermas especially, is very much of the school of thought that reason shall prevail, as you know, it once went, and It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. That dialogue, rationalization can continue to extend to all parts of the life world. We can negate the impulse towards an intensifying agonistic politics if we adopt the right epistemic and linguistic approaches, and then tries to systematize that in a wide variety of different ways. So I do want to stress their work operates at a very high academic level generally, but whereas MOOF's at the very least has the virtue of being agonistic and politically minded, Honneth especially, and Habermas for that matter, the kind of price paid for their scholarship is a lot of this works at a very high level of remove, right? Habermas just published a 3-volume history of philosophy that I've reviewed the first 2 volumes just this week. It's quite interesting, right? But calling it, a call to arms would be, well, not just an overstatement, right? A kind of wild overestimation of what the book is going to do. In terms of like what Honneth argues specifically, what's interesting about him is he's still very sympathetic to the broadly left aims and socialist aims of the Frankfurt School, but he thinks that Hegel by himself, for the most part, possesses the conceptual resources, not only to agitate for a critical theoretical perspective, with some important assists from Marx, but also to tell us what kind of ethical society we should move towards. Right. So just very briefly, one of Honneth's most interesting claims is that Western civilization and Western society has been entranced by 2 concepts of freedom for too long. The first concept of freedom is the classic negative conception of freedom that we're all familiar with, this idea of don't tread on me. And Honneth says, actually, socialists by and large have been too indifferent to the importance of negative or classical liberal liberties, right? He says there really is something that's valuable about asking to be left alone to your own devices, at least in some spaces. Then the second concept of liberty that he also has a lot of commendation for is, of course, the positive concept of liberty. This is all drawn from a criticism of Isaiah Berlin's essay. And the positive concept of liberty, of course, is about empowerment or expanding the array of choices that you have available to you in your life. The idea being, while Bernie Sanders or someone like that, if I'm denied access to healthcare because I'm not able to afford it, the array of options that'll be available to me in life are likely to become a lot more narrow because I'm going to be spending all my time working at a Denny's trying to earn enough money so that I can, get my new hip. But what it's interesting about Honneth is he adds a third dimension of freedom, what he calls social freedom, which he aligns with the call for the democratization of life. And this is where you can definitely see the influence of someone like Marx, and not just Hegel, because he says, look, social freedom requires that we have a society that is, for the most part, free of hegemony, where people are capable of taking a kind of rational distance from the forms of life in which they inhabit, and to ask themselves if they are genuinely emancipatory in the way that they should be, and if they aren't, to exercise their social freedom in order to remake society. And as I point out in my recent review of his book, he starts to extend this to the workplace as well, in a manner that I think is very admirable, where he says we should experiment with things like worker co-ops, perhaps even, subsuming large parts of the economy to, socialist ends. It's not exactly clear to me how different this is from what's sometimes called the Republican concept of freedom, which is very much in vogue in some left circles right now. See Bruno Leopold's book, Citizen Marx, right? But it's a very admirable project, right? In some ways. The problem I have with it is, again, if you're looking for Hanith to get political juice for a kind of radical project, or to feel animated in confrontation with reactionary forces, you're just not going to get that, right? What you're going to get instead is a stately 500-page book that will talk about every interpretation of Hegel that he's come across over the last 50 years, some very fine-grained analysis of this, and that's what you're going to have. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? I just think that sometimes I think MOOF's work would benefit from being a little bit more like Hanith's, and sometimes I think Hanith's work would benefit from a little bit more of the energy and agonism that you see in MOOF's work.
I guess that does kind of bring us to now, and I wanted to ask you, as we talk about now, last time we talked, we were in the waning stages of good old Joe Biden aging into his extreme dotage, Uncle Joe, but ice cream instead of steel, Nonetheless, now we're in Trump's second administration, and we've seen a transformation of the right that is even different from the first transformation that Trump brought to the right, and it's had unforeseen consequences in many directions.
You don't say. I mean, if you had told me back in even 2024 that Canada would be precipitously close to calling America, enemy number one, I tell you that it's time to stop hitting the bong so much. Let's just put it that way.
Right? Yeah. And if you'd have told me that
you've watched the South Park movie a few too many times,
right? And if you'd have told me that we'd actually wag the dog ourselves after, friendshoring to the point of, why do we even need to make Canada a state? We had a totally integrated economy. The only thing we didn't share was a currency, and to see that theoretically dismantled in a few months. And for those of you who read your Project 2025, it isn't in there. There's nothing in there about a trade war with Canada.
Trump just like tariff is the most beautiful word, right? I think that's a big part of the motivation.
Or you'd see an attempt and a rebuff at normalizing with China, and then that going to pot very quickly, or any number of things. Because people are like, oh, it's all in Project 2025. I'm like, no, this is even weirder than that.
Oh yeah.
Like even I thought maybe this was going to be like Trump 1 and the Project 2025 shit was like his old white papers from 2016. And nope, but it also isn't really a blueprint either, because it's much stranger. How do, I think on one hand, a lot of people see the Democrats even now, even especially now, as a weak response to all this. I was reading the paper, and I think that the popularity and general approval of the Democratic Party has fallen from 2008, where it's 60%, to 29% today. And it's not because people like Trump.
Mhm.
They didn't like the Democrats anyway. It's former Democrats being incredibly frustrated with the lack of action.
Well, I
And
mean, look at Chuck Schumer the other day, right? I mean, the first little bit of leverage he had on Trump, give us something or the whole government will shut down. He somehow managed to go into a meeting with Republicans, come away with absolutely nothing, and they got everything that they wanted, right? And it's like, Jesus fucking Christ, man. Can't you come up with any better deal than, okay, we get nothing. They take a giant shit on us, and then they get whatever it is that they want from us. Please, sir, I want some more, right? It's just fucking baffling to me.
right, me too. And so on one hand, it would seem like liberalism as it is associated with parties like that, at least in the United States. Now we can talk about how this may be helping the prospects of liberalism abroad. Didn't save Germany, but although we can really thank the SPD and the Greens for that more than anything else. But we've seen all kinds of pivoting in the European Union. If you'd have told me in December that we wouldn't be looking at a right-wing Canadian government by the summer, I would have laughed at you. And now I'm like, the Liberals may survive, and even if they lose, they're not going to lose by much. Wow.
They could actually win a majority government and be far stronger than they were going into this. Yeah, it's baffling.
It is baffling. So it seems like both a complication for and a moment of liberal socialism, because illiberalism seemingly has had a backlash to a backlash. We had a backlash to the kind of nothingism, and I use that as a slur that was used for a certain group in China in 1978, which was the Chinese Center leadership. But it basically means you do so little that we barely remember you in history. To and I'm not a popular frontist still. I want people to understand that before people misunderstand me. But it does seem like there is a scramble to redefine a lot of these terms and views in light of where we're at. I mean, I would not have guessed that Ezra Klein would be pushing an Elizabeth Warren-ish agenda. Not that I agree with it, but I wouldn't have predicted it either.
Yeah, I mean, I was at a Bernie rally just 2 weeks ago, right? It was a weekend off election season, and almost 10,000 people showed up, right? To a tiny little high school, right? There was an overflow room for the overflow room, right? Really astonishing stuff. I think that to your broader question, I think what has become very, very clear is that a kind of centrist neoliberalism that dominated the Democratic Party, and for that matter, many liberal parties across the Western world, is, if not in terminal decline, very much in life support, certainly in the United States, and I predict elsewhere also. Although, like you said, Trump might help revive it in some places like Canada, right? And I think that there are very good reasons for this kind of neoliberalism to have become so profoundly unpopular. It had different wings. There was a more right-wing version of it, a more left-wing version of it. But for the most part, it was defined by a lack of concern for ordinary people in the country, and the people who managed the leading parties were not shy about expressing this lack of concern for what ordinary people thought. I mean, for me, the moment I knew that the Democrats were going to be in trouble in 2024 was, of course, when candidate Clinton, back in the day, was asked a question. I think it may have even been on The View or some talk show, where she was like, what would you say to voters who are concerned that the Democrats aren't offering enough and are maybe doing a lot of bad things in Gaza? And her response was, get over yourself, right? Look at the alternative. What else are you going to do? And I thought to myself, like, Jesus Christ, right? So your attitude towards the voters isn't that you have to justify why they should vote for you. They should get over their hangups about this and get on board with your program, because the only other option is Donald Trump, right? Now, I want to point out, in the 2024 election, things were a lot closer than Republicans tried to make it out, right? had a couple 100,000 votes in the swing states gone another way, we would have wound up with President Kamala Harris, right? But clearly enough people, when presented with this kind of attitude and this kind of program, when told the choice is neoliberal centrism or Donald Trump, they thought, well, thank you very much, but I'm going to take Donald Trump. Let's do it, right? And I think for any kind of liberal party to be effective in the future, certainly in the United States, it needs to be committed to an awful lot more than just this extremely technocratic approach to politics that says we're going to try to assemble just enough groups together to form a winning electoral coalition. We're going to give every little one of them a little bag of goodies, but not too much, right? Because we can't go crazy. And then we're going to hope that all these people are going to turn out on election day, right? What the Republicans have very clearly understood is that to mobilize people, you do need to offer a kind of vision and, to use Murph's term, a kind of agonism. Now, the vision that they are offering is terrible, right? As we are seeing unfolding right before our eyes, right? And there's a reason, to your point, why I think Trump has become extremely unpopular very quickly for most Americans, right? But the Democrats have done very, very little thus far to offer a competing and compelling vision of what the country should look like. And I think that if they were to be smart, they would recognize that there's a reason why people like Klein and AOC and Bernie Sanders are the thought leaders and the movers and shakers in the party, like right now, right? As in many ways they have been for quite some time, right? And it's because people really want, A, to know who the enemy they have to oppose is. Pointing to the oligarchs is a good example. And B, what a positive vision of the country will look like. And, you know, they laid it out. One that's going to be committed to Medicare for all, post-secondary for all, reunionization, you name it, right? Now, from a socialist angle, there are, of course, a lot of reasons to be critical of this as reformist, inadequate, etc. But I do think that it is definitely would definitely be a hopeful thing if we were able to get the Democratic Party to pivot from being a intransigently centrist party without any kind of interest in advancing a leftist agenda and very hostile to leftists within it, to one that was more open to discussing more radical kinds of social transformation.
Yeah, I mean, I find this somewhat fascinating. I'll give you a story, because I was watching the defeat of Jamel Bowman and in his rallies in New York. AOC and Bernie both went and sized them up and tried to help him out right after endorsing Biden. And to tell you how different it was just a year ago, less than a year ago, there was 500 people in the greater New York area, one of the, most left-friendly, densely populated areas in the United States, at this rally. Versus today, where you can get 10,000 people to hear Bernie because at least he's saying something against the Trump administration. And yes, I would probably, and no, I wouldn't probably, I know I would still be complaining about the Democrats if Bernie was their leader, but I would actually feel like at least I was going somewhere when I was complaining about them. Like, I don't even think that these current 80-year-old neoliberals in, like Schumer can even... I can't even make fun of them and feel good. They're so weak.
Oh, I know. I mean, especially when they'll sit there and they'll bitch like, this isn't the party of Reagan. It's like, man, Reagan fucking was 40 years ago, man. 40 years ago. Like, get with the fucking time. They don't give a shit about not being the party of Reagan anymore. And also, let's be clear, Reagan was a fucking asshole also.
Right, I know. It is kind of special, that appeal, and it feels like they're trying to do the same thing that they did about George W. Bush, because I heard that too, and I'm just like, this is a completely different phenomenon. You don't know how to fight it. And so it's interesting. On one hand, I mean, the other thing that we've seen is the kind of rise and stagnation of the return of sectarian Marxism. Mm-hmm. We've seen the Trotskyist parties have mostly collapsed, with the exception of the RCI, RCA, RCP, depending on which country you're in, and Dear communists, can you come up with more names? How many RCPs do there need to be? Anyway, our workers' parties while we're at it. But nonetheless, except for them, most of the other Trotskyists have gone away. We've seen a lot of Marxist-Leninist groups emerge, but they've taken on bizarre ideologies. Marxist-Leninism, Duginism, Marxist-Leninism, John Calhoun thought. I don't know.
I mean, talk to Steve Bannon, right? Steve Bannon is a big fan of Lenin.
Yeah, we're in a very bizarre time, and we've also seen the growth of something that you and I were talking earlier about France, where you'd see these weird French ideologies emerge. But we have seen that again, where we've seen like super conservative, former ultra leftist Marxist Leninism, or
MAGA communism,
or liberal socialism, but we like Trump even more than the MAGA communist, or whatever. Like,
well, listen, if you're a liberal socialist that has anything good to say with Trump, don't fucking cite my work in any way, shape, or form, unless you're willing to sit there and be like, this is all trash or something.
Yeah. So I do think we're in a particularly weird moment, and a lot of people will be reaching for ideologies again, because there isn't a clear answer for where these sectarian movements can move, and the DSA seems to be back on the ascendancy. I mean, one of the ironies of the Biden administration is at the beginning of the Biden administration, the DSA was almost 100,000 people, and at the end of it, it was somewhere between 55 and 65,000 people. So it lost between a third and half of its membership in those 4 years. And it is interesting to see, because it seems to be back on the incline again, but it also there's kind of a low-key Cold War within the DSA between Democratic Party adjacent factions and factions that want a party, and then there's the factions that want a party are like split 5 different ways. So
that's the problem, right? It's like I've been asked that problem more than anything else. Like, do you think that we should separate and create a new left party? It's like, I'm not opposed to hearing the idea. The problem would be, what kind of fucking left party do you want to create, right? Because I don't know if you've ever spent any time on like the left or the far left, but those people don't fucking agree with each other either.
No. I mean, my favorite thing is, even if you think you agree with each other, you get a group of Marxist-Leninists and a group of Trotskyists and a group of the 3 or 4 major types of Maoism together, and then you ask them a question on any domestic or geopolitical problem, and actually they'll be like, half of the Trots agree with the weird Maoists, but they hate them. Those Trots and Maoists hate each other for historical reasons, but they actually agree about domestic politics today. And then that's also true with like half of the reformist part of the DSA and half of the Marxist-Leninists are both really Dougists, and you're just like, but they hate each other because of the names. It's just kind of funny.
I got involved in that myself a little bit. So I'm in DSA, right? I make no bones about that. Ecumenically, I'm in DSA. Let's just put it that way, right? But I remember there's that big debate about whether AOC was taking a hard line enough on Israel-Palestine, and so New York DSA still endorsed her, but the national DSA was a little more wary about it because they were very influenced by, I think it was like the Marxist Unity Group in DSA. And I said, I think getting rid of her is a bad idea because I think she's a good vehicle for encouraging people to be more interested in socialism. And quite frankly, DSA needs her a lot more than she needs it at this point. And boy, oh boy, did I get a lot of angry people messaging me being like, how dare you, don't draw a line at this point. And I think I fired back like, look, for the average American who's not really online and doesn't have, a copy of State and Revolution, under their pillow, saying you are like AOC is not left wing enough for you is a giant red flag, right? So I don't know what else. I don't want to kind of relitigate that, right? But all that's to say, right? That really did expose me once more to the fact that, look, even if we were to form like a democratic socialist party, the idea that that would overcome any disunity amongst us, I think, is a bit of a pipe dream.
No, I mean, look, the agonistics, to use MOOF's term, does not just exist between us and the right. It does and will always exist between us and each other.
Yeah.
And I mean, here's one other thing. I actually think that is somewhat healthy. There are times, however, to draw a united front, and I use that term advisedly, as a proper sectarian. And there's a time not to, and right now I'm like, well, I'm not sure, I'm not on Team Popular Front right now, but things are pretty bad, and maybe we should, hash this shit out at a different time.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Like, I think that debate on the left is healthy. I actually think it can be a sign of intellectual dynamism, right? Where there's this broad conformity or unanimity on most issues. It really means that your movement is dead rather than vital, right? What Alistair McIntyre say in After Virtue, right? As soon as a political tradition becomes Burkean, it's already dead, right? There's no real point in trying to resuscitate it. On the other hand, to your point, healthy disagreement is one thing. I am not going to cooperate with you to get the lifeboat down while the Titanic is sinking is not a healthy kind of disagreement, right? At that point, it's like, well, we can all fucking go down together then, I guess, and nothing will be accomplished. So I really don't know what the solution is for the American left, quite frankly. I know that I have my own political program of what I'd like to see realized. I do think that there are reasons to be somewhat optimistic about what's occurring. And then I'll end with this. I think that one thing that is a positive sign for me if I was looking for it. And right now I'm quite pessimistic about things. I want to be clear, right? Is the fact that a lot of people are very concerned about the impact that Trump is going to have on the broader world. But what I think is very clear to your point is that actually this presidency has really demonstrated the extent to which America's power and geopolitical influence has shrunk quite dramatically, right? And you see this all over the place, right? Canada, which many people expected was just going to roll over when Trump threatened with tariffs, basically gave the United States the finger and said, well, if we have to take economic contractions and recessions year in and year out to not have to put up with you anymore, then so be it, right? And right now, those kinds of attitudes are polling at 60, 70, 80% support in the country, and they go up day in and day out. Or look at Europe, right? That was even more dramatic. When Trump basically made it very clear that he wanted the war in Ukraine to end and he wanted the Ukrainians to surrender, every European state said basically, fine, if that's your attitude, we will rearm and we will arm the Ukrainians, right? Now, I'm not taking sides in that particular conflict, right? But 10 years ago, the idea that European states aligned with the United States would decide that they're going to pursue effectively an independent foreign policy and just be indifferent to what an American president wants would be, again, unthinkable, right? So if you look at things that way, what's very clear to me, at least, is that America's geopolitical centrality in the world is shrinking alongside, let's be blunt, its moral character with this particular government in office, right? And I expect that that's probably going to only increase as time goes along. It's going to create an awful lot of problems. So that does create some opportunities to militate against things like the Washington Consensus, American imperialism, and to try to think about different ways to recalibrate geopolitics and a more potentially more cosmopolitan socialist direction. Although how to go about doing that, I'm really not sure at this point.
Well, I do think the American left, and this, I know that there's some people who are going to disagree with me, but doubling down on nationalism right now would be a particularly stupid move. I mean, for us, one, we already live in a multipolar world. We're going to see what that means. It means one of the things it means is political alliances are much more unstable.
Oh, yes.
I don't know that I feel great about Germany rearming again, but if I will say this, it's bad. Not just that Germany was willing to Germany and France are willing to forego American leadership for the first time since World War II, but they're willing to take on debt to do it.
Yeah,
like exactly. That's unheard of.
I mean, and that's a real testament to just how concerned they are. I mean, there's not been a European leader yet that's been expressly rude to Donald Trump. But if you think about that gesture, right, we are willing to go into debt just to not have to be dependent on you any longer and to do whatever the fuck we want without having to answer to you. It's a real sign of the fact that they seem to have come to the conclusion that Trump is not just some aberration that the Americans went through for 4 years. It seems like this is something that's got to work out of its system, which means America is going to be an unreliable ally and probably involved, shall we say, in its own issues. So they're just going to back away from all that and do their own thing. And again, like you said, kind of unprecedented. I never would have thought that would happen.
Right. I also want to be clear. I'm not happy with either the American or the European stance towards the Russia-Ukraine war, but it is interesting that that's where this leads. In some ways, I will also admit that is part of Trump's foreign policy to have Europe rearm itself and do its own security. Trump has said so. But there's other things that he doesn't seem to have realized that would lead to. Maybe he doesn't care. I don't know. I tend to view Trump as what I like to call lizard brain intelligent, which means he's not playing 3-dimensional chess or 4-dimensional chess. He's playing checkers, but God damn it, can you win at checkers sometimes?
Absolutely. I think that people seriously underestimated the skill set that he does have, and I've said that for a long time, right? Like, he is a brilliant marketer, right? I mean, my friends and I mean, a lot of leftists I know love his fucking tweets, right? I mean, Little Marco, Crooked Hillary, these are like iconic bits of Americana at this point that are going to echo down through history, right? And he's got a talent, right? But to your point about not playing chess, I don't think what a lot of people realized is, yes, America had to essentially subsidize European security, right? While the Europeans built great big welfare states, but they got an enormous amount from that. Not least was the ability to all but dictate European foreign policy, and in many cases domestic policy, because what else were the Europeans going to do about it, right? A more militarized Europe, almost by definition, is going to be a much more independent Europe that is going to feel very free to tell the American president in the future, you can go fuck off right now, please, and au revoir at that, right?
Although the other thing I will say is this cuts in a lot of directions, because I also think European power is waiting too.
But relative in the world, sure,
yeah. I think we just have a world where there's a lot more major players, and we're gonna have to deal with that.
I mean, we haven't even talked about China, right?
Yeah, we haven't even dealt with China. One of the things I would say that if I was going to give advance to either liberal or just regular old leftist, North American solidarity would be important right now. I really do believe that. Like, we need to have solidarity with Mexico and Canada. I know my Canadian friends might be surprised given how much slag I give them. But as I told you off air, I like to make weird American nationalist jokes to piss off Canadian nationalists, because I know the only like real identity that a lot of non-French speaking Canadian nationalists have is that they're not Americans and they're thus morally superior to us.
And healthcare, don't forget that.
Yeah, and they have healthcare, although they underfunded in certain provinces.
Without a doubt.
But at this moment, I do think we need to have solidarity with our North American brethren. There are better ways to integrate people into a polity than to threaten to turn them into Puerto Rico or one state. I mean, as you and I said, it's one of the few things that could actually unite Canadians.
Yeah, and has.
I'm
not gonna lie, like I have seen very, very conservative friends that I grew up with, right, in small town Ontario, the kind of people that were like fucking, what are all like these people wearing dresses around here for? I think these are dudes, aren't they? That kind of thing. Who are like the most anti-MAGA types in the world right now, right? Won't buy American whiskey, won't listen to American music, just want to have nothing to do with the United States. And I've also seen American conservatives get really surprised and perplexed by it. And it kind of pisses me off because I'm like, you do realize that it is a different country and that Canadian nationalism, when confronted by an overwhelming and potentially aggressive American nationalism, is almost certainly going to become anti-American, right? And, consequently, the couple of people who are kind of maple MAGA types are now almost always called quislings. I've even seen that word thrown around by the Canadian media, right? And it's like, what a weird time to be alive.
It is strange. And like we said, it seems to have saved the Liberal Party in Canada's political prospects for the time being.
That and being absolutely ruthless, right? I mean, I don't think people understand the Liberal Party of Canada all that well. There's a reason it's been in power pretty much unendingly for more than a century now. The minute they realized that JT was going south, they were like, all right, knives out, gone. All right, next guy.
Yeah, they'll do that. I mean, I think it's interesting as far as it goes where we're going to be. It's going to be interesting where the European conservatives go. I will say this: I was shocked at some of the French conservatives' response to Trump. Like, I think one of the center right basically called him a traitor. I can't remember who exactly said it, but it wasn't a Le Pen type, but it was a influential kind of rightish of center right politician. And I was like, okay, this has gone in a different way than expected.
And even Nigel Farage, right, is increasingly trying to distance himself, and he was the kind of person who would brown nose with Trump any chance he got back at the time. Back in the day,
I know. So. It is interesting. It might also give the Labour Party in the UK a few more months in power. So anyway, I do think that's, for me, this is an interesting place for leftists to be, to kind of parse where they are and where they aren't, because I think one of the problems that we're going to see, and this will be my last comment and then we can wrap this up, is that we need to understand our history better to understand where we're going. And what we see right now amongst the left, whatever that is, and I say that sometimes sarcastically, but right now I really don't know, because I can find a leftist group that has any position, including positions to the right of rightist groups. Mm-hmm. And I think right now would be a time to kind of figure out where you really are and to maybe quit LARPing. And the thing is about doing politics is that you actually have to do politics, not just post about it or even go to protests. Like, politics requires you to engage in civic and civil society in a way that's beyond posting. I'm not saying posting's unimportant. I'm not saying the internet isn't the real world, even, because it's part of the real world, people. If you're still saying that, you're delusional.
Yeah, by 2025, if you think the internet doesn't have a difference, then I don't know what to fucking say to you.
Right. But I also do think so does real brick and mortar politics. That does still matter. And that mattered for Trump, because I guarantee you posting isn't what's scaring the GOP into being quiet. What Trump seems to accidentally or intentionally, I don't know, perhaps engineer a recession. So
yeah, I mean, that could be fine. I mean, as a fellow millennial, right? I sat there and been like, I'm fucking emotionally ready for another one, baby. Bring it on, right? I'll just fucking sit there and sell my kidney and keep on rolling. But for my last comment, I think I'm just going to say this. My friend Ben, our friend Ben, likes to quote Freddie de Boer a lot, and I have seen this over the years, and I think it is an insightful piece of wisdom. And what de Boer used to say is, one of the reasons that the left is in a pickle is because many people on the left will say, if you disagree with me about one thing, then I can't have anything to do with you because you've adopted a kind of a moral stance. And many people on the right will say, if you agree with us about one thing, you're already most of the way there. So let's just have a couple conversations and we'll see if we can push you all the way there. Right now, that's something of a caricature. But I've seen that often enough to know that it does align with something real. Right. And I think what the left needs to do provisionally going forward is focus, yes, on what we all are going to be ideologically committed to, but also recognize that we need to convince people that aren't already on our team that we are offering them something better than what is available right now. And I think that this is actually, interestingly enough, a good time to make that pitch because a lot of people, like to point out, are really pissed off at the Democratic Party and very, very pissed off at what Trump is doing. So there's an opening there, right? And rather than kind of adopt this puritanical mindset of you need to get on board with the right principles and the right attitudes right away, let's just try talking to people. And to your point about doing politics, see how much they're willing to take on board, stay in contact with them, and then things will play themselves out.
Right. You don't know you don't know how far people are willing to go once you talk to them either. And I think that's also, we've been surprised with that with a lot of former left liberals who are now, to the right of Dick Cheney.
You say that, but I mean, I have a buddy who's a neoliberal economist, or was a neoliberal economist, right? The Trump era, and a couple of conversations with him, and he now said, I'm an Adorno person, right? I think that, he's actually right about things, and I've become very anti-capitalist. So it can go the other way, right? And I don't think
definitely can.
Appreciate that.
Well, I think my last thought is I don't want socialists to adopt the position of some resistance liberals in America who are like, we will not accept any former MAGA people. And I'm like, that's fucking stupid.
Yeah, totally.
like if people come and ask to want to join you to fight your enemy and they're willing to talk to you and hear you out in a way that they were never willing to do before, you don't go, well, you came over but too late, so fuck you, and I also don't trust you, you're still a bigot. And I'm like, how do you unmake bigots if you just assume that once you've been a bigot you'll be a bigot for your entire fucking life? Like, that's dumb. Like, it's not my experience with people either. So
no, not at all. We need to create spaces for people to come on board, right? Now, don't get me wrong. That doesn't mean we should start sitting there and being like, well, we just need to understand Nazis, right? Let's just dialogue with them and be compassionate.
We need to forgive Dick Cheney. No, I'm not saying that either.
No, exactly. There are limitations to any kind of principle. But, Tom, Dick, or Joe who voted for Donald Trump because they didn't like woke culture because they heard something bad about it. And they're also just unhappy with inflation. Absolutely. These are people that you can talk to and try to get on board.
Right. And I would say you can do that without trying to tail the right too, because the other thing you and I both complain a lot about is leftists who are like, well, if we just acted more like the right, we'd win. And I want to point out, in Europe, a bunch of parties have tried that. In the last 3 years of election, all of them have done worse than predicted in Germany and Britain, etc., because people don't trust them on either side.
Yeah. Oh, totally right. It turns out that if you have a choice between voting for the right and voting for a leftist pretending to be on the right, a lot of people will just decide to fucking opt for the real thing. Right. What a thought, right?
Yeah. Why drink new Coke? So that doesn't mean you don't talk to like, I have a lot of conservative friends. I think people should know that about, but the other thing about you and I is, you deal with Canadian conservatives mostly, which is a very specific kind of person, but and I deal with like red staters, but I've talked to tons.
It's a bit easier now, especially over the last couple of months, because a lot of them have been like, you know what, I hate MAGA too. It's like, well, kind of like you were saying, well, get on board, mate. The water's warm, step in the tub.
Yeah. Red Tory, if you just drop the Tory, you're there. No. But anyway, thank you so much, Matt. Where can people find your work?
Sure. You can find me writing on things like Jacobin, Christian Socialism, Current Affairs, Commonweal. And if you want, just send me an email, mattmcmanus300@gmail.com. I do my best to get in touch with everyone.
All right. Thank you so much, Matt. Have a good rest of your day.
You too, Derek. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Bye-bye.